"Hold on, my friend," I said to Labarbe. "You've just said it again, that Pig Morin. Why the devil have I never heard anyone mention Morin without that epithet?" Labarbe, now a deputy, stared at me in disbelief. "You mean you don't know the story of Morin? And you're from La Rochelle?" I admitted I didn't. Labarbe rubbed his hands together and began his tale. "You knew Morin, of course. You remember his enormous haberdashery shop on the quay?" "Yes, of course." "Good. Well, in 1862 or maybe 63, Morin went to Paris for 2 weeks. Officially to buy stock, unofficially for pleasure. You know what it means for a provincial merchant to spend 2 weeks in Paris? The blood starts to boil. Every evening, shows, fleeting encounters, constant stimulation. The mind loses its bearings. All around, dancers in tights, actresses with plunging necklines, full calves, generous shoulders, all within reach, yet untouchable. Occasionally, one gets a taste of something simpler, but one leaves with a heart burning for kisses that merely brushed the lips. In that state, Morin bought a ticket for the evening express to La Rochelle. Agitated and regretful, he wandered through the vestibule of the Orleans station when he suddenly froze. Before him stood a young woman kissing an elderly lady. She lifted her veil, and Morin murmured, "Damn, what a beauty." After bidding farewell to the old woman, she entered the waiting room. Morin followed. Then onto the platform, he followed again. Finally, she stepped into an empty compartment, and Morin, of course, followed. There were few passengers. The train whistled and departed. They were alone. Morin devoured her with his eyes. She looked about 19 or 20, tall, fair-haired, with confident manners. She wrapped her legs in a travel blanket and stretched out on the seat, preparing to sleep. Morin wondered, who is she? 1,000 guesses, 1,000 schemes raced through his mind. He thought, there are so many stories about railway adventures. Maybe this is mine. Courage is everything. Didn't Danton say, dare, dare, always dare? Or was it Mirabeau? Doesn't matter. But I lack courage, that's the problem. Oh, if only I could read her thoughts. We pass by dazzling chances every day without knowing. And maybe all she needs is a gesture, a hint. He began to imagine how it might unfold, a chivalrous introduction, small favors, a lively, charming conversation, a confession, and everything that follows. The night passed. The girl slept, while Morin dreamed of her downfall. At dawn, the first ray of sunlight lit her face. She awoke, sat up, looked out the window, then at Morin, and smiled. It was a gentle, cheerful smile, the smile of a happy woman. Morin shuddered. It was a sign. She seemed to say, "What a fool you are. Sitting here with a pretty woman and doing nothing. Don't you like me?" She kept smiling, even laughed. Morin fumbled for words, a compliment, anything. But nothing came. Then, with the coward's boldness, he thought, to hell with it, I'll risk it. And without a word, he lunged forward, arms outstretched, lips puckered, and seized her in an embrace. The girl leapt up, screaming, "Help!" She flung open the compartment door, called for assistance, tried to jump out. Morin, panicked, held her by the skirt, stammering, "Madam. Oh, madam." The train slowed and came to a halt. 2 attendants rushed to her cries. She collapsed into their arms, whispering, "That man, he tried to," and fainted. The train was standing at the station in Moors. The duty gendarme had just placed Morin under arrest. When the young woman, shaken by his crude behavior, regained consciousness, she gave her statement. An official report was drawn up. And it wasn't until evening that the unfortunate merchant finally made it home, charged with offending public decency. At the time, I was editor-in-chief of the Cherrant Beacon and saw Morin regularly in the evenings at the commercial cafe. The morning after the incident, he came to me, utterly distraught. I didn't hide my opinion. "You're a pig. One simply doesn't behave like that." He wept. His wife had beaten him, he already saw his business collapsing, his name dragged through the mud, and his friends, outraged, refusing even to greet him. I felt sorry for Morin and called in my colleague Rivet, a cheerful, resourceful fellow, to ask his advice. He suggested I speak with the public prosecutor, with whom I had friendly ties. I sent Morin home and went to see the official myself. It turned out the victim was Mademoiselle Henriette Bonnel, who had gone to Paris to earn her teaching diploma. She had no living parents and was spending her holidays with her uncle and aunt, modest bourgeois folk from Moors. The situation was complicated by the fact that the uncle had filed a formal complaint. The prosecutor was willing to drop the case, but only if the complaint was withdrawn. That was the goal. I returned to Morin and found him in bed, laid low by shame and anxiety. His wife, a tall, bony, sharp-tongued woman, was berating him without pause. She led me into the room, shouting in my face, "Come to admire that Pig Morin, have you? Well, here he is, darling." She planted herself in front of the bed, hands on hips. I explained the situation, and Morin begged me to find the family. It was a delicate task, but I agreed. The poor man kept repeating, "I swear to you, I never kissed her, not once. Do you believe me?" I replied, "That doesn't change a thing. You're still a pig." He handed me 1,000 francs, to be used at my discretion. Unwilling to approach the girl's relatives alone, I asked Rivet to accompany me. He agreed, on the condition that we leave immediately. He had urgent business in La Rochelle the following evening. 2 hours later, we were knocking on the door of a country house. A beautiful young woman opened it, likely the one. I whispered to Rivet, "Damn it, I'm beginning to understand Morin." The uncle, Monsieur Tunnelet, turned out to be a subscriber to the Beacon and a staunch political ally. He welcomed us with open arms, shook our hands warmly, delighted to host editors from his favorite paper. Rivet murmured to me, "Looks like we might just settle this Pig Morin's affair." The niece withdrew, and I broached the delicate subject. I hinted at the potential scandal and pointed out the damage that publicity could do to the girl. After all, no one would believe it had stopped at a mere kiss. The uncle clearly hesitated, but said he couldn't decide without his wife's consent. She was expected back only late that evening. Suddenly, he exclaimed, "Wait, I've had a splendid idea. Stay with us. You'll dine here, spend the night, and when my wife returns, I'm hopeful we'll come to an agreement." Rivet initially protested, but his desire to rescue that Pig Morin won out, and he agreed to stay. The uncle, beaming with delight, rose to his feet, called for his niece, and invited us to stroll through his estate, adding with a smile, "Serious talk, that's for the evening." Rivet immediately launched into a political discussion with him, while I found myself a few steps behind, walking beside the young lady. She was truly charming, yes, undeniably charming. With the utmost delicacy, I began speaking to her about the incident, hoping to win her sympathy and perhaps gain an ally. But she didn't seem the least bit embarrassed. On the contrary, she listened with a light, amused expression, as though the whole affair struck her as rather entertaining. I said, "Just think, mademoiselle, of all the trouble that may await you. A court hearing, inquisitive stares, the ordeal of recounting that unpleasant scene in the carriage before a room full of strangers. Between us, Wouldn't it have been better simply to put that fool in his place, avoid the fuss, not call for help, and quietly move to another compartment? She laughed. You're right. But what can I say, I was frightened. And when you're scared, you don't think. Once I realized what had happened, I truly regretted crying out, but it was too late. Just imagine, that idiot lunged at me like a madman, without a word, with a face like someone who'd lost his mind. I didn't even understand what he wanted from me. She looked me straight in the eyes, confidently, without a trace of shyness. I thought to myself, what spirit! No wonder that Pig Morin misread her entirely. I replied with a faint smile. Come now, mademoiselle, surely he deserves a little leniency. After all, it's hardly possible to be alone with such a beautiful woman as yourself and not feel a perfectly natural urge to kiss her. She laughed even louder, flashing her pearly white teeth. Between desire and action, sir, there ought to be room for respect. The phrase sounded a bit quaint and not entirely coherent. Suddenly I asked, well then, what if I kissed you right now, what would you do? She stopped, looked me over from head to toe, and calmly replied, oh, that would be quite another matter. I knew full well, damn it, that it truly was another matter. Around here, I was known as Handsome Labarbe, and I was 30 at the time. Still, I asked, and why is that? She shrugged. Simple. You're not as foolish as he is. Then, casting a quick glance at me, she added, and not nearly as ugly. She barely had time to pull away before I planted a loud kiss on her cheek. She jumped back, but it was too late. She said, well, you're not shy either. Just don't make a habit of that. I assumed a humble expression and murmured, ah, mademoiselle, I would gladly stand trial for the same offense as Morin. She looked surprised. And why is that? I stopped smiling and met her gaze directly. Because you are one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Because for me, it would be a badge of honor, a title, a triumph, to be accused of trying to possess you. Because if people saw you, they'd say, this time Labarbe didn't get what he usually does, but still, he was lucky. She burst out laughing again. What a character you are. She hadn't finished the word character before I had her in my arms, showering kisses on her hair, her forehead, her eyes, her lips, her cheeks, every part of her face she hadn't managed to shield in time. Eventually, she broke free, flushed and unmistakably offended. You're a brute, sir, she said, and you've made me regret ever listening to you. I caught her hand and, slightly flustered, whispered, forgive me, mademoiselle. I was rude, I offended you. But what else could I have done? If only you knew. I searched in vain for some kind of excuse. After a brief pause, she replied, there's nothing I need to know, sir. But I had already regained my composure and exclaimed, mademoiselle, I've loved you for a whole year. She looked at me in genuine surprise, raising her eyes to mine. I went on. Yes, mademoiselle, please hear me out. I don't know Morin, and I couldn't care less what happens to him. Let them try him, let them lock him up, it's all the same to me. I first saw you here, a year ago. You were standing by the gate. One glance and I was struck. Since then, your image hasn't left me. Believe it or not, I don't care. You seemed utterly enchanting, and the memory of you took hold of me. I longed to see you again, and so, here I am, under the pretext of settling that scoundrel Morin's affair. Circumstances pushed me beyond the bounds of propriety. Forgive me, I beg you, forgive me. She studied my face, trying to read the truth in my eyes, already on the verge of laughing, and whispered, storyteller. I raised my hand and said with heartfelt sincerity, and I truly believe I meant it at that moment, "I swear to you, I'm not lying." She replied simply, "Go on, then." We were alone, completely alone. Rivet and the uncle had vanished into the winding paths of the garden, and I began my confession, long, tender, with kisses on her hands. She listened as if it were something sweet and unexpected, unsure whether to believe me or not. Gradually, I myself began to feel moved, began to believe my own words. I turned pale, my breath grew uneven, my body trembled, and my arm gently encircled her waist. I whispered into the curls near her ear. She stood still, lost in reverie. Then her hand met mine and gave it a soft squeeze. I held her closer, slowly but more firmly, and she no longer resisted. I brushed my lips against her cheek, and suddenly her mouth met mine. It was a long, lingering kiss, one that might have lasted even longer had we not heard behind us a "hum." She darted into the thicket. I turned, and there stood Rivet. He stopped in the middle of the path and said gravely, "So this is how you're handling that Pig Morin's affair?" I replied with a smug smile, "Everyone has their own methods." "And the uncle? Any luck?" "As for the niece, I'll vouch for her." "I had less success with the uncle," said Rivet. I took his arm, and we headed back to the house. At dinner, I completely lost my head. I was seated beside her, and our hands kept meeting under the table. With my foot, I gently pressed against hers, and our glances crossed more and more often with every passing moment. Later, we went for a walk under the moonlight. I whispered to her everything my heart suggested, tender words, trembling, almost prayerful. I held her close, kissed her endlessly, never lifting my lips from her moist mouth. Ahead of us, strolling slowly, the uncle and Rivet were deep in conversation. Their shadows glided solemnly across the sanded paths. Back at the house, we learned that the telegraph operator had delivered a message. The aunt would arrive only the next morning, on the first train at 7 o'clock. "Well then, Henriette, show our guests to their rooms," said the uncle. We shook his hand and went upstairs. She first led us to Rivet's bedroom, and he whispered to me, "Funny how she didn't take us to your room first." Then she escorted me to mine. As soon as we were alone, I embraced her again, trying to cloud her thoughts, to overcome her resistance. But sensing herself falter, she slipped away and fled. I lay down irritated, agitated, embarrassed. I was certain I wouldn't sleep a wink. My mind spun. Had I made a fool of myself? And then a soft knock at the door. "Who is it?" I asked. "It's me," came a barely audible voice. I dressed quickly and opened the door. She stepped in. "I forgot to ask," said Henriette, "what do you drink in the morning, chocolate, tea, or coffee?" I rushed toward her, showering her with kisses, babbling incoherently. "I drink. I drink. I drink." But she deftly slipped from my arms, blew out the candle, and vanished. I was left alone in the dark, furious, fumbling for matches. I couldn't find them. At last, nearly mad, I stumbled into the corridor with a candlestick in hand. What was I doing? I wasn't thinking anymore. I was going to find Henriette. I wanted her. I took a few steps, and suddenly the thought struck me, what if I run into the uncle? What will I say? I froze. My mind was blank, my heart pounding. After a moment, I found my excuse. I'll say I was looking for Rivet's room, urgent business. I began inspecting the doors, trying to guess which one led to her. No clues. I turned a handle at random. Entered. Henriette was sitting on the bed, staring at me in confusion. I quietly locked the door and tiptoed toward her. I forgot to ask you, mademoiselle, for something to read. She resisted, but soon I found the very book I'd been looking for. I won't say its title. It was a marvelous novel, a true poem. I turned the first page, and she let me read as much as I pleased. I read so many chapters that the candles burned down completely. When I finally thanked her and crept back to my room, a firm hand stopped me. A voice, Rivet's voice, whispered in my ear. So you still haven't settled that Pig Morin's affair? At 7 in the morning, she herself brought me a cup of chocolate. I had never tasted anything like it. The drink was soft, velvety, fragrant, intoxicating. I couldn't tear my lips away from the delicate rim of her cup. No sooner had she left than Rivet appeared. He looked irritated, like a man who hadn't slept all night, and said grimly, "If you keep this up, you'll ruin that Pig Morin's case completely." At 8 o'clock, the aunt arrived. The discussion was brief. It was agreed that the complaint would be withdrawn, and I would leave 500 francs for the local poor. The hosts urged us to stay another day, even proposed a walk to see the ruins. Henriette, behind her relatives' backs, nodded to me. Yes, yes, stay. I was ready, but Rivet insisted on leaving. I pulled him aside, pleaded. "Rivet, my dear fellow, do this for me." But he was beside himself and kept repeating, "I've had enough, you hear? Enough of that Pig Morin's business." I had no choice but to leave with him. It was one of the hardest moments of my life. I would gladly have spent my whole life settling that affair. In the train, after a firm, silent farewell, I said to Rivet, "You're a brute." He replied, "My dear friend, you're beginning to drive me mad." As we approached the offices of the Charente Beacon, I saw a crowd waiting. The moment they spotted us, a shout went up. "Well, did you manage to settle that Pig Morin's affair?" All of La Rochelle was abuzz. Rivet, whose mood had lightened during the journey, could barely contain his laughter. "Yes, all thanks to Le Barbe. We went to see Morin. He lay in an armchair, mustard plasters on his legs, a cold compress on his head, worn out by anxiety. He coughed softly, like a dying man, and no one could explain where the cough had come from. His wife watched him like a tigress, ready to pounce. When Morin saw us, he trembled, his hands and knees began to shake. I said, "It's settled, you scoundrel. Just don't go starting again." He rose, gasping for breath, seized both my hands and kissed them as though they belonged to some prince. Then he burst into tears, nearly fainted, embraced Rivet, and even his wife who, with a single sharp motion, shoved him back into his chair. Morin never recovered from the ordeal. The shock had been too much for him. Throughout the region, he was now known simply as that Pig Morin, and each time he heard the nickname, it pierced him like the tip of a blade. If a street urchin happened to shout, "Pig," Morin would instinctively turn his head. His friends never missed a chance to mock him, especially at lunch, asking as they carved into a ham, "Is this yours?" He died 2 years later. As for me, in 1875, while campaigning for a seat in Parliament, I paid a visit to the new notary in Tuss, Metrobeloncle. The door was opened by a tall, beautiful, voluptuous woman. "Don't you recognize me?" she asked. I stammered. "No, I don't, madam. Henriette Bonnel." "Ah." I felt the blood drain from my face. She remained perfectly composed, smiling at me with a hint of amusement. When she left me alone with her husband, he took my hands and gripped them so firmly I thought he might crush them. "I've long wanted to meet you, sir. My wife has spoken so much about you. I know, yes, I know under what unfortunate circumstances you first met. And I also know how impeccably, delicately, tactfully, and selflessly you conducted yourself in the matter." He paused, then lowered his voice, as if uttering something indecent. "In the matter of that Pig Morin,